My 2-year-old daughter started crying more and more in the middle of the night. My husband, who always complained about her cries keeping him up late at night, despite the fact that he had work the next morning, suddenly said,
I'll go calm her down, honey. You haven't been getting much sleep these days, right? You rest while I take care of it.
With that, he picked her up gently and left the bedroom. I was genuinely surprised with this sudden transformation of his. I wondered if he had a change of heart, in which case, thank goodness. But a few minutes after he went out into the living room with our daughter, I noticed something extremely unusual and decided to check in on him. I went to the living room only to discover him pushing her on the floor and stuffing her mouth with Kleenex. "What are you doing?" I body slammed him away from my daughter, whose limbs were limp and her breathing shallow. This is the story of how my husband brutally assaulted my own daughter, enough so that her life was in genuine danger, and how I was able to save her just in the nick of time. My name is Magdalena, better known as Maggie, and I'm a 25-year-old part-time housewife working for a popular neighborhood cafe. I have been married for 3 years to my husband, Kendall, who was also a high school classmate. We used to live together, the three of us, with our daughter Danielle, who was 2 years old at the time of the incident. I was looking for a nursery school with the intention of restarting my full-time job as soon as Danielle was born. But the search for a nursery school in the area, with many children on waiting list, did not go well, and I was only able to enroll my daughter this year when she just turned 2 years old. However, right after she started preschool, she often got a little sick, which led to the preschool calling me pretty often. This unfortunately made me leave my part-time job early. But considering how Danielle was born prematurely at around 7 months and 3 weeks, I always had to be aware of her health. With this in mind, going back to a full-time job was not going to happen. So after some negotiations with the president of the branch where I used to work, I went with his suggestion of working as a part-time administrator for one of the cafes they managed. It was in our own neighborhood, and the nursery where Danielle went was just a few blocks away too, so it was a really convenient solution. Plus, I was hired with a special vouch from the president, who was told of my nice working performance in the office. Thus, I decided to return to work on a shortened working schedule. Kendall, meanwhile, was a very busy man, and that's why I didn't think about having him pick up his daughter from daycare from the beginning. But my workplace sometimes had to resort to calling him when I couldn't respond to a call on my personal cell phone. At first, he accepted the fact that such a course of action was inevitable, and he understood that the calls were going to come at some point or other. But perhaps he never thought the calls would be so frequent. The daycare center called pretty much every day, and at least 3 of those times were to him. He became increasingly frustrated, and as soon as he received a call from the daycare center, he would call me at work and complain about it. And so, life like this went on and on.
Unlike you, Maggie, I work full-time, alright? I just cannot keep getting these calls to my office. It's a nuisance to everyone here.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch their calls myself, Kendall, but I'll be there to pick her up, don't worry.
Of course you will. I'm busy enough as it is providing for the family, and I don't need any daughter to interrupt me in whatever way she could. And tell the daycare not to contact me from now on, alright?
I sighed deeply, exasperated at his harsh words. My workplace was very understanding about my situation with my daughter, and allowed me to carry my personal phone while I was working. I explained to Kendall that I was careful and that I tried to be as flexible as possible, but there were times when I couldn't answer the phone while serving customers. But he was never satisfied. He said that getting such calls to his office, where his private life wasn't supposed to be shown at all, pretty much was a problem in itself. When my daughter was born, he used to say that it wouldn't hurt at all if he had to leave to take care of her. And what about when I was pregnant with Danielle? We even talked about helping each other out, but I think Kendall eventually came to think that his own daughter essentially rejected him because she really wasn't too clingy with him, despite being quite clingy with me. Perhaps he also got a little frustrated because of how often Danielle seemed to be getting ill at preschool. All things considered, it was an unfortunate situation. There was another problem. Mrs. Morrow, my mother-in-law, who lived nearby, began to complain to me about her son's situation every time we saw each other. I heard that Kendall's workplace is getting contacted all the time because you don't answer the daycare center's phone calls at all. Have you considered what would happen if these calls get Kendall fired from his job? Even so, Kendall is Danielle's father and also one of her emergency contacts. You have to take good care of your own child so that Kendall won't be overburdened with so many unnecessary things, all right? I thought that parenting is supposed to be a cooperative effort between parents, Mrs. Morrow. Oh? I've personally never asked my husband to help me raise my children, now have I? People nowadays always complain that men don't participate in child rearing, saying it's a one-parent job. But it's my opinion that just because the wives want to be spoiled to some extent, it's stupid, selfish, and childish. My father-in-law passed away before I ever married Kendall, so I only know what kind of man he was from hearsay that came from Mrs. Morrow and my husband. She may have truly raised her son on her own since they both always talked how he was a workaholic. Compared to those days, though, I think we ought to feel blessed now that many men are actively participating in child rearing. I mean, wouldn't you agree? The reason why Danielle isn't very clingy with Kendall is because of your lack of effort in the first place, Maggie. My efforts? Children are simple, and they will be attracted to those who actively care about them. Kendall won't be amused if you don't work on that and try to create opportunities for him to spend time with his daughter. Why did I have to think about my husband, who was an adult, fully capable of communicating something to improve a certain situation, and make all the arrangements for him instead of with him? And how does one make an effort to make a child love their father dearly while telling the same man not to help me raise our child? The logic here was extremely contradicting at best. Believe me, I tried to give Kendall some time to be involved in his daughter's life ever since she was born. He was her father, after all, and I knew full well that Danielle would have so much more going for her if she had two parents who cared for her instead of one. But when she started developing the ability to communicate herself, her father started coming home after I put her to bed and didn't leave the bedroom until afternoon on weekends. And when he did wake up, he would just lie on the couch and watch TV and never engage with his daughter in any way. It was because of this particular lifestyle of his that we haven't had a proper conversation as husband and wife recently. It was the same for my daughter as well. When Danielle asked her father to watch her write some letters and hand games that she learned that day at daycare, he just stared at her with a bored look on his face and said,
Enough with this stupid nonsense. Get ready for bed.
He never tried to make her happy, at all. And as a father, he was failing miserably, I thought. Anyone sensible could come to the conclusion that if my daughter wasn't clingy with her father, that's completely on him. I felt that it was unfair. False accusations to say that I wasn't making enough effort when my husband himself wasn't actively trying to get involved with our daughter's life. After a while, though, she started getting sick less and less and was finally able to go to daycare far more regularly and for longer periods of time. But when one door closes, another one opens, in the sense that when one problem goes away, another comes to replace it. She started waking up in the middle of the night and crying violently. When I consulted the doctor, he told me,
It's probably because her body clock is just now starting to develop more rapidly, and it's simply not stable just yet. At around 2 years old, a child wakes up thinking it's going to be morning, and they may be surprised and therefore stressed to find it's still dark. They may still be tired during the day and may not be able to switch back on to lively and energetic. My advice is that you help her establish a stable rhythm of life and reassure your daughter by holding her and comforting her. I don't think you'll have any more problems if you keep at it, ma'am.
The catch was that we lived in an apartment, and Kendall had to sleep in the same room as my daughter. Whenever she woke up crying at night, it would evidently annoy him, and sure enough, as the days and weeks passed, he was getting increasingly frustrated. His lack of proper sleep didn't really help his attitude much at all, and talking to him was like trying to navigate a minefield.
Come the frick on. She's been taking long naps at daycare, right? Maybe they're too damn long.
Her nap time isn't any different than when she was at home, honey.
Then the time of her nap isn't the best. She's gotta change it.
No one can just shift Danielle's nap time now, can you? What if she isn't tired? Can you just be patient a little longer until she finally finds a certain groove?
When will she find that groove, eh?
I can't say when exactly, but
Why am I not freaking surprised? I'm wasting my time talking to you.
oh, come on now. That's a bit harsh, Kendall. You don't talk to your wife and daughter like that.
She was definitely cuter when she was a newborn. I'll tell you that for free.
With that, Kendall took a pillow and blanket and went into the living room. Sighing, exasperated with his attitude, the thought of divorce popped into my head, and I began to think about working as a full-time employee. One night, after many nights like this, Danielle woke up in the middle of the night and started crying as usual. I was about to leave the room with my daughter in my arms when Kendall, who had been sleeping next to me, woke up. "I'm sorry for waking you up, honey. Go back to sleep. I'll take care of her."
Is she crying again?
"Yes, but she's almost asleep." As we were talking, Danielle started crying again. My heart plummeted into despair. I had just spent 20 minutes doing what I could to calm her down. I didn't think I had it in me to go for another round. Kendall sighed deeply, yawned, got up from bed, strode over to me, and outstretched his arms. He put his hands under her armpits and pulled her gently away from my arms.
Don't cry, sweetheart. Daddy's here.
I looked at my husband in bewilderment as he patted her back and spoke softly to her. He then turned to me and said,
You haven't been getting much sleep these days, right? You rest while I take care of it.
"But..."
I think I can at least hold her for a little while and feed her. It'll be okay.
With that, Kendall walked out of the bedroom, Danielle whimpering in his arms. For a while, I was genuinely surprised with the sudden transformation of his. He was treating our daughter with such care, a complete 180 from the way he had been treating her for the past few months. I knew for a fact that he loved her long before she was even born, and birth only intensified that love. I wonder if he had come to treat her with affection again, like he did back then, for good this time. Or did something happen that gave him a change of heart? Even after they had left the room, I could still hear her cries coming from the living room for a while, and I was slowly starting to doze off. As I was, however, suddenly, the crying stopped. That was very strange. Even if Danielle had stopped crying, it seemed unnatural to stop completely abruptly after such a long time of crying. That's when my maternal instincts suddenly screaming for some reason, ordering me to kick off the covers, jump out from bed, and run to the living room. I went to the living room, only to discover him holding our daughter down on the floor, as if he was riding her. My eyes opened wide, and I immediately ran towards him. I body slammed him as hard as I could, and luckily, I was able to knock the wind out of him. My full weight pushed him away, and he fell to the floor with a loud thud. "What are you doing?" I held my daughter's small body in my arms. Her face was a mess of tears and snot, and her mouth seemed completely puffed out. I saw something white inside, and only after getting it out of her mouth did I realize what Kendall had been doing. He had been stuffing loads and loads of Kleenex into her mouth. Danielle's limbs were limp and motionless. "Danielle!" I put my finger in her mouth and took more Kleenex out. My daughter's face contorted in pain. Then it occurred to me that in my haste to put my finger in her mouth to remove the Kleenex, I might actually be making the problem worse by forcing it deeper into her mouth. If I continued to block her airway, she wouldn't be able to breathe. I carefully pulled out more Kleenex, far more gently and composedly. This time, I called an ambulance at the same time. The bundles and bundles of Kleenex that I pulled out of her mouth were stiff and hard with her saliva. I wondered if she had somehow cut the inside of her mouth because some of them were even stained red. My daughter's face was pale and her breathing was shallow. My mind was racing, but I continued to administer first aid in accordance with the emergency center's instructions over the phone.
She just wouldn't stop freaking crying.
"You shut up! Shut the frick up now!" Behind me, Kendall was mumbling cursed with blasphemy. All of that was just noise to me right then, and my focus was all on resuscitating Danielle to the best of my capability. The ambulance finally arrived, and I got inside with my daughter on a stretcher. I could see the paramedics telling my husband to follow in the family car. They took us both to the hospital, where she started receiving immediate attention, but my daughter's face was still pale. I wondered if I had blocked her little airway with my frantic efforts to save her. Or maybe I should have removed all of it, even if I had to risk hurting her. No, that's just stupid. These were the only thoughts in my mind, and nothing could have kept my body from shaking. A few hours later, as I continued to pace impatiently, refusing to calm down and sit in one of the hospital chairs, the doctor in charge, Dr. Vega, said,
"The treatment is finished, ma'am. You may see your daughter now."
On the bed in the hospital room, Danielle was breathing regularly. Her complexion was still not restored to normal, but it seemed more flushed than before. I saw her small chest rising and falling smoothly, and my strength drained from my body. I collapsed to my knees, so relieved that she was okay. Kendall stood silently next behind me.
Thanks to you extracting a good deal of the Kleenex from her mouth, Miss Morrow, she seemed to be able to breathe better in the ambulance. I believe that made all the difference, and had you not done that, I'm afraid her life would have been in critical danger.
Is my daughter going to be okay now, doctor?
Since she has swallowed some of the material, we just have to wait for her to expel it naturally. There's also a risk of intestinal obstruction, so I advise keeping her here in the hospital under observation.
Dr. Vega, a kind, middle-aged man, crouched down and held my hand in both of his. They felt warm and calloused with experience. In the dim light of dawn, I could see a smile. But the next instant, his expression changed to one of apprehension.
Some children do accidentally eat Kleenex, which could involuntarily cause a blockage in the throat. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Miss Morrow. She didn't eat Kleenex of her own free will, did she?
No, she didn't, doctor. I nodded quietly, and at the same time, Kendall screamed.
Hey! Don't say anything unnecessary.
I'm only telling the truth.
That's exactly what's unnecessary.
Let's move to a better spot. Can't have little Danielle hearing any yelling right now.
The doctor urged us to go into the reception room. That's when I saw my own parents and mother-in-law running into the hospital. As soon as I entered the room, my mother-in-law was furious with me, asking me what the frick I was doing. I glared at her, thinking her clinically insane that she was blaming me, even in a time of crisis like this. Kendall is the one who hurt Danielle, you know, Mrs. Morrow. In any case, you put an unnecessary burden on him again, didn't you? Unnecessary burden? What do you mean? Come now, Maggie. My boy is working, isn't he? Didn't I tell you to think about him and his situation a little more?
For real. If only you had paid more attention to me and my situation.
I do admit that your job is a lot harder and more demanding than mine. But ever since she's been enrolled at daycare, you've barely lent a helping hand in raising your own daughter, Kendall. Even when they called you because I couldn't answer my phone, I was always the one who went to pick her up, and you never took off work when Danielle had to stay home because of her health. Now did you? But I heard the poor darling's been crying a lot at night lately and hasn't been allowing Kendall the chance to sleep well. That's where you ought to have. Then let me ask you this. Do you think it's still acceptable to stuff loads and loads of Kleenex into a child's mouth? The fact she very well might choke on it notwithstanding? What? You stuffed Kleenex into her mouth, Kendall? That's right. Danielle almost choked to death tonight, Mrs. Morrow. And you still tell me that you don't believe it's your own son's fault? Kendall, how could you? When Mrs. Morrow tried to grab the cowardly Kendall, the doctor stopped her with but a single thrust of his arm back against her.
So it was the father who stuffed Kleenex into Danielle Morrow's mouth?
Yes, doctor. Maggie, you shut the frick up. Wow, so some things really do run in the family, don't they? You and Kendall think exactly the same way, don't you, Mrs. Morrow? You do realize I have no reason to remain silent about what your son did to my daughter. You don't have to bother to tell anyone. How about we just cover the whole thing up? Say it was an accident or something. As Mrs. Morrow stormed menacingly towards me, my parents, who were waiting outside the room until then, exploded inside and began hollering at her.
You're asking our Magdalena to cover up something that threatened the life of our own granddaughter? Explain yourself, woman. Now!
One wrong move, and little Danielle could have lost her life for Christ's sakes. Well, this is merely figure of speech. Mrs. Morrill started to panic, as if she remembered my parents' presence. Now I know exactly what your intentions are, Mrs. Morrill. What do you mean by intentions, dear child? I don't have any malice towards you, right, Kendo?
That's right. We don't.
Then pray tell, what was your intention when you said, how about we just cover the whole thing up? Because there's no need to make a big deal out of it.
Danielle's alive, anyhow.
Of course there's a freaking reason to make a big deal about it. I swear to God, I'm this close to losing it. People, you better tread carefully.
That's right. I stopped my parents, who were now advancing towards the two traders. I told my husband and his mother, "You people can't seem to see Danielle still suffering in that hospital room, huh? It turns out that to you people, she and I are essentially handmaidens, whose only existence is to be there to do everything you want us to do. And if something happens, you just fake it and make us deal with it." When did we ever say that, my child?
You were sure as hell thinking it.
Dad, please, let me handle this. Kendall, be prepared, because I'm going to tell the hospital and the police everything. Everything, as honestly and accurately as I can, and you will be punished accordingly.
No, please. Wait a minute. Please.
Mrs. Morrill, would you kindly get the hell out of the hospital immediately? You're no more than a hostile stranger to me now. She argued for a while, but she was eventually removed from the hospital by Dr. Vega and a few nurses. The hospital called the police, and Kendall and I were questioned by multiple officers and detectives, as well as a child guidance center. My parents were asked to write down their contact information as my guarantors on a document addressed to the police station, which made me a little ashamed of causing a lot of trouble. But they reassured very kindly that they would do anything in their power to help me and their granddaughter, and give that bastard of a husband and his mother the rightful justice they deserved. Danielle was hospitalized for a few days to be examined and observed. Although she had reportedly been feeling faint for a while, she was recovering well without complaining of any pain in her belly. And once the Kleenex she swallowed stopped appearing in her stool, which was 3 days after she was first hospitalized, she was sent home. Kendall was subsequently arrested and charged with assault and attempted murder. The court found no extenuating circumstances, and I refused to accept a private settlement, so he is currently serving a 15-year sentence in prison with no probation. I thought that even such a big punishment wasn't enough, considering the sentence for assault is from 1 month to 15 years. But after thinking about he would lose his social credibility, would be fired from his job, and now had to live away from any familiar place with his mother, I eventually deemed the justice appropriate. I am now back to working a full-time job, and I live with the help of various people at work and at the daycare center. Danielle, traumatized by the incident, started to cry whenever she saw a Kleenex for a while, but with the help of her grandparents, I was able to balance my work and life at home, and as I spend time with her, I prioritize her mental health, and as of now, she is on the road to complete recovery. She can hold Kleenex in her hand now without even whimpering, but she does flinch and squirm whenever I try to blow her nose with one. That's why a towel's been doing somewhat a good job as a substitute. I'm going to raise her in such a way that she can overwrite such painful memories with happy and joyful ones.